Hey, it's Dr. Astar Bear, and in this lecture, we're going to be talking about class. What is that as a theory, the theory of class, and what is class analysis? Okay, so class, uh, the word itself, uh, of course, just means to categorize, right? So, categorize, okay? And this means that in order to understand society, we're gonna break it down into groups. Okay, so a natural way to proceed, right, to break society down into categories or groups or classes, right? Now, the question is, right, if we're gonna do this, right, if we're gonna break society into groups, not literally, right? I mean, just for the purposes of analysis. Nobody's getting broken or anything. It's just for in order to understand. Okay, um, so if we're going to do this, the question is, well, how do we form the categories? How do we form the classes? On what basis are we doing this breakdown? Right? I mean, there's many different ways we can form groups in society. Right? I mean, there's it's varied. I mean, let me just mention a few. Right? We could, for example, we could break society down on the basis of wealth. All right, very common. So example, then if we did that, we would have, at the simplest level, we would have, like, say, the rich versus the poor, for example, right? And maybe, we could do finer gradations if we wanted to. We could say, okay, this group is somewhere in the middle and whatever, right? So that would be a form of class analysis, okay? And this form of class analysis is very old. It has a long history. Aristotle talks in this manner, for example. I mean, for the whole history of Western thought, basically, we have this form of class analysis at times appearing, okay? And then not all the time, right? It's not to say that that dominates necessarily, but it's an idea with a long history is the point, okay? Uh, we could also do it slightly different or a kind of a variation. We could do it not on the basis of wealth, but of income, right? Now, just so that we're clear on this, the difference between wealth and income, wealth is a static thing, right? And wealth has to do with what is the total value of the assets that you own or possess, right? Income is a flow, okay? Income is how much value you are receiving over time, right? And these are different things conceptually, okay? They were often related, but they're different conceptually, okay? So, the entire theory of investment and investment returns is based on the idea that you would trade wealth in order to obtain income. And the question is, at what rate of return, right? That's okay. So anyway, if we created class on the basis of income, we often see this, for example, with discourse that became popular coming out of the Occupy movement, which said there is the very top, right, the 1% versus, like, the rest of us, the 99%. Okay, yeah, so it's another version of rich versus poor or whatever, but this one having to do with income rather than wealth. Okay, which is different, right? Um, you could, for example, you could own a $500,000 home and not have a huge amount of income because your job doesn't pay a lot or whatever, right? So on paper, you're wealthy, right, because you have $500,000 in assets, but your income could be much lower than that, right? Just to show the difference between these two categories, okay? So class on the basis of wealth and class on the basis of income are actually both very old, right? They both have a long, well-established history in terms of analysis, okay? We could also construct our notion of class on the basis of power, okay? So who makes the decisions in society, right? Are you having decisions made for you, or are you the one making the decisions, right? So some notion of power. From this, we would get, for example, a notion of the ruling class, right? That group of people that make the decisions versus the powerless or disenfranchised, those who have no real say in the decision-making process. Okay, so based on power. Now, obviously, in a lot of societies, right, wealth and power are highly related. Okay, so it's not to say that these forms of class analysis are against each other necessarily. They just have a different focus, right? This one who has the wealth, right? This one who has the income. This one who has the power, who makes the decisions. Okay, so again, all very old, right? We could also look at it in terms of uh, who has ownership of certain things that are important in the society. Okay, so for example, land ownership. Land ownership for a long time in European history very restricted. You had to be of noble birth in order to own land. So we get from this the idea. Sometimes you hear this term, the landed gentry. Okay, so landed gentry, for example, versus the peasants who do not own land. Okay, so another example, class analysis. We could construct our classes, our groups in society, on the basis of racial characteristics, right? So this would be a race-based analysis, right? Um, Now, of course, the problem that we could note with this is hardly scientific, right? It depends on the appearance of people, and this is subjective, right? So, but we could. This is this is newer actually. This the way this because for a long time in Western thought, what we now call race didn't mean what you look like. It meant where you're from. Race was synonymous with nation. Um, so you could say something like the Italian race, right? Um, so that conflicts with our modern notion of race, right? Our modern notion of race has much more to do with appearance, right? Um, so, a person who is from Italy might be indistinguishable on the basis of appearance from somebody who's from Portugal, for example, right? But we would, the old notion of race meant nation. Anyway, the point is, we could construct classes on the basis of race or nationality or whatever, right? Um, we could break society down into, for example, black, white, Asian, or whatever we call these races, right? So this is another way of categorizing society, right? The question is, what characteristics is it based on, right? And now we can see this is actually going to be probably quite different than our other ways of categorizing, right? Because what your race is may or may not correspond to how much wealth, income, power, ownership, or etc. Right? So these forms of class analysis can be very, very different. Is the point here, right? We could also break down society perhaps on the basis of occupation, and then we would have, for example, something like workers, landlords, intelligentsia, these types of categories. Okay, so based on, well, what is your occupation? What do you do for a living, right? So, and again, this is different, right? Because whether you have a lot or little wealth, I mean, obviously there's some relationship with your occupation, but it's different. It's a different focus. Okay, so what we're going to focus on, I mean, there's many, many others I can mention, right? All of these are actually pretty old, right? So all of these have a long established tradition in Western thought. Okay, there's one which is newer. Okay, and we're going to focus on this to a large extent in this course. Okay, it's newer, and in a lot of ways, I think it's actually a lot more sophisticated than these other forms of class analysis. Okay, this newer one that I'm referring to is unique to Marx, right? So one of the things that Marx contributes to, human thought in general is this new theory of class, this new way of analyzing society, a new way of breaking down society into different groups, and on a different basis than what had existed in the past. Okay, so it's because it's newer, then it's harder for us to understand because it doesn't have as long an established tradition, right? A lot of times, this newer view of class, sometimes it ends up getting rolled up and collapsed into these older notions, okay? Because to be honest, right, sometimes Marx and the Marxists who followed him um, do use these other kinds of analysis, right? Um, especially depending on what's being analyzed, right? That I'm not saying that these are wrong, right? I'm just saying they're older, right? The newer thing is always harder to understand, right? So, what is the uniqueness that Marx brought? Okay, so that's class with a very particular definition, right? Class meaning the relationship uh, to the production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus, right? Class as the what a long phrase this is, right? This is already difficult to understand. The production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus. Okay, so let's just review for the moment what is surplus. Okay, so surplus is based on a fundamental distinction in Marxism. I touched on this, described this in previous lectures, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, surplus means the distinction between necessary and surplus labor. Okay, so Marx notes that, okay, this is Marx's argument, right? Every society that exists, you have people performing surplus labor. Okay, so every society has this, right? Like every society performs labor. Okay, labor is a fundamental way we have of relating to the world. And those who perform labor, we could break down their day, right? How much time do they spend in labor? And we could say, okay, so here's one day's labor, right? Now this doesn't matter if we're talking about we could be talking about a society that is prehistorical. It's 100,000 years ago, right? Before we have any writing or anything from that era. Maybe we have a cave painting or two, right? But that's it, right? Here's one day's labor of a worker, let's say a producer in that society. Okay, so Marx notes if this rectangle represents the whole day's labor, only a portion of that day is what we could call necessary labor, right? That means labor which goes to support the worker, the direct producer. Okay, so NL, necessary labor, right? A portion of the day. Well, what is the rest of it, right? The rest of it is surplus labor, right? The labor that is above and beyond the necessary. Okay, so SL, surplus labor, and that is above the necessary labor, right? Any additional amount of labor that is done above and beyond the needs of the direct producer. Okay, every society produces surplus. Okay, and Marx's surplus is produced at the point of production. Okay, so we could talk about surplus on the macro level, right? That is, what is a society's total surplus out of all of the different production processes, labor processes, right? There's many different people performing labor in a society. Well, probably 100,000 years ago, societies were a lot smaller, bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers. But anyway, you get the idea, right? There's many people's labor, right? And they're doing different forms of labor, but they're all producing a surplus. Okay, so that's the production of surplus. Right, we've just covered that first part. How much of it is necessary? How much of it is surplus? And there's interesting things in here as well, like, well, what does society consider to be necessary, right? That actually changes over time, and there's not, it has some kind of basis to it, which is, look, we all have basic needs. We need food, clothing, shelter, etc. But we have additional needs that were given by society, right? As society grows and develops. So, for example, right, 100,000 years ago, very few people had shoes, right? Um, you know, that's the pre-shoe era, right? So they wouldn't see a shoe as necessary, right? Now, in modern society, everyone has lots of pairs of shoes, right? I mean, and if you don't, that's seen as, well, you have less than the bare minimum that somebody needs, right? I mean, so that's just an example, right? So what is considered to be necessary is a socially determined thing, right? And it will change as society changes. Okay. The next point has to do with the appropriation of surplus. Okay, so the appropriation, long word there, that means the taking of the surplus, right? So when we're looking at the appropriation of surplus labor, we are asking the question: who takes or owns or makes decisions about society's surplus? Okay, so again, whether we're looking at it on a macro level, maybe you're making decisions about a lot of society's surplus, or maybe we're looking at it on a very micro level, right here at this point of production, who is making the decisions about the surplus, who owns that surplus, and so forth, right? So what Marx notes is that it's often a different group, okay? So it is often the case, right? Often the case in a society that those who appropriate, right, are not those who produce. Okay, simple insight. Especially as societies grow and develop more over time, one of the aspects of that development is that they produce more surplus. Right, the total amount of surplus is much greater now than it was 100,000 years ago because humanity is much further developed economically. Right, we're producing more of all kinds of things, and then it would stand to reason that we're also producing more of a surplus. Now, along the way, we have a much expanded notion of what is considered to be necessary, right? Right. So, like I said, shoes are considered necessary, not in the past, right? Electricity, indoor plumbing. I mean, these are things that did not even exist in the past and are now considered basic necessities, right? We could add something like internet service. So, see, this is constantly in flux, right? Constantly in development. And Marx was very clear about that, right? The necessary labor is not physically or biologically determined, even though it has a component of that, but is rather socially determined, and it depends on the product of development of the society. Okay, so back to this point about appropriation. Those who appropriate are not the same as necessarily those who produce. Very common, right? So Marx refers to this as class exploitation. Okay, class exploitation. Those who produce and those who appropriate are often different groups, right? Um, so, and Marx says is like, look, this is often the basis of society, okay? Meaning it is incredibly common, right? Now, it may not occur for absolutely everybody, right? There may be some who don't experience it, but it's very common, right? It's the basis, it's prevalent. Marxism is very interested in this topic, right? Class exploitation, okay? Because the argument that Marx made and that comes out of Marxism that Marxists have followed is that this class exploitation is immoral, okay? It's morally wrong, right? This is a very important thing to understand in Marxism, right? That says, look, here's the ethos. It's that those who produce should also be the ones who own, control, take, appropriate that surplus, right? That we should, right, because this is morally wrong, that it's a kind of socialized theft, right? And by the way, it's much bigger than any other kind of theft in society. Like, oh, somebody said, "Oh, give me your money." They took your wallet or whatever. Maybe a bank ripped you off with fees or whatever. That's terrible. I mean, those are crimes. But this is much greater than all of those other things put together, right? So Marx like focus on the big crime, focus on the big theft, not the small theft. But of course, it's totally legal, right? Like I said, most of the time, this is the basis of society. Okay, so because Marxists are so interested in this, right, and says, look, what we should be trying to do is we should be trying to, at the very least, we should be trying to minimize the amount of exploitation. And ideally, where we'd want to get to is we'd want to abolish it altogether, right? In the same way that we would want to minimize anything that's a negative for society, right? Anything that's morally wrong, anything from assault to rape to murder. I mean, these are negatives, right? They're very big negatives in society, and so we do what we can to try to minimize them, if possible, right? Um, we would love to get to a point where there's less of that, right? Because that causes human suffering, right? We want a society that works for all, right? I mean, and rich, poor have kind of a common stake in this, right? Nobody wants to be murdered or have someone that they know or love, experience that, right? So, there's a kind of common human interest that we all have here in minimizing, human suffering, right? So, Marxists point out, well, class exploitation is a big one, right? And not only that, but it's connected to a lot of other social ills as well, okay? If class exploitation is when somebody else appropriates the surplus, by the way, Marx, is interested in this, right? So we can refer to the rate of exploitation, right? We can say, not only is this happening, right? Yes or no, but to what extent is it happening, okay? So Marx also refers to this as the rate of surplus value, okay? In other places, rate of exploitation is a kind of more general way of looking at it, even if the products of labor do not take on a value form, right? Like that's common if we look at history, okay? We don't always have production for the market, okay? The products of labor are not always in value terms, okay? But we can still define a rate of exploitation, and that is in general the amount of surplus labor over the amount of necessary labor, okay? So by putting these relative to each other, and assuming that somebody else takes the surplus, right? Then we can say, okay, how intense is the exploitation that's occurring, right? So, again, the goal of Marxism, like first of all, let's try to, if there's exploitation, let's try to reduce the rate of it, right? That would be a good first step. Then let's try to move away from it, okay? Let's try to have less exploitation, minimize it, and then perhaps we get to the point where we'd say, you know what? No, we don't accept it at all. It's not valid. It should be against the law, right? Just like murdering somebody is against the law, right? So that would be a point we might get to further on, right, in the future. Okay. Okay. So how does this happen, right? How does it occur that those who appropriate the surplus are different, right? So here's the point, okay? That class exploitation is supported by other stuff that's happening in the society, okay? By a variety of social processes, okay? So, we could look at, for example, the political, cultural, or even natural processes that take place in society, okay? Now, these things create, Marx uses this term, right? The social formation, okay? So, social formation, it's a nice phrase because rather than using the term society, I mean, let's be honest, we're also going to use that one. The term society is a common one to use, so I use it as well, right? Social formation really focuses our attention on the formation, right? The development, the evolution of this, right? The fact that it can change, that it's in flux, that it's contradictory, right? These are all very big areas of focus for Marx and for Marxism, okay? So a social formation, here we have systems of class exploitation and the politics or the political processes, the cultural processes, and the natural processes which then support that, okay? Now, some of these, so here's the idea, right? All these processes form what we could call conditions of existence. Okay, so a social formation that involves this, right? That involves class exploitation, again, very, very common. Well, why does it exist? Well, it has certain conditions of existence, right? It has, again, it has a set of processes which produce and then reproduce that exploitation. Okay, produce and reproduce. Okay, so they create it and they continue it. Okay, produce and reproduce exploitation. Okay, so and this makes, there's different ways that this can happen. Okay, lots of different ways, because the history of society going back, right? I mean, Marx and Engels have a famous quote, right, which is, the history of societies is class struggle. I'm paraphrasing here, right? But class struggle meaning there's exploitation and there's struggle over that exploitation. Okay, so class struggle refers to the tensions, contradictions, conflicts, whether they be open or covered over, repressed, right? That are related to, that are at play in terms of a system of class exploitation. Okay, so due to exploitation, right? The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, something like that. Okay, I didn't look the quote up before I started my lecture. This is all of this is different, right? I mean, there's many different examples of this, right? The history of societies long, right? So there's lots of different kinds of labor going on, lots of different class struggles going on, right? But could we say, like, okay, there are some common elements looking back historically, okay? So the common elements which allow us to kind of say, look, this kind of production, this form of production and appropriation of surplus is similar to this other one, right? So what are these common elements? Well, they have something to do with a constellation of political, cultural, natural processes which together form a certain kind of class exploitation with a certain kind of character, okay? Now, by the way, okay, we've talked about two of the elements, okay? Production, right? Who's doing the labor, who's actually producing. Appropriation, who is taking, owning, controlling the surplus, right? The final one is distribution, okay? So distribution of surplus means that we might have to take some of the surplus and spend it to obtain the conditions of existence which are going to allow that exploitation to continue to exist, okay? So this topic of the distribution of surplus, okay, that is, take some of the surplus that we appropriated and use it to obtain the conditions of existence, okay? So that'll become clear in a moment. I know this is a little bit abstract, but okay, if we talk about these common elements, we could say there's 5 of these, okay? Marxism, we call them fundamental class processes. Okay, so 5 fundamental class processes. And again, this notion, using the term processing here, that's important, right? Because class has often been understood to be a static thing, right? Rich, poor, fairly static, right? Or, this race or that race, right? Again, that's pretty static, We are trying to shift our understanding away from a static into a process, right? Something that's dynamic, okay? So fundamental class processes, all right? And these differ in terms of what are the conditions of existence, right? What is that type of social formation that allows for this particular kind of class process to take place, okay? And we typically find a mix of these class processes occurring at once. Okay, so our 5 fundamental class processes. I'm just going to write FCP. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Again, we are talking about forms of production, appropriation, and distribution of the surplus in society that produces something that has some common elements. Okay, so let's talk about one which I've talked about this in previous lectures, right? Um, it's feudalism. Okay, so and these are in no particular order. I'm just covering this one because we've already spent some time on it. Okay, so the fundamental class process that is associated with European feudalism for that, about 1,000 or 1,200 year period that feudalism exists in Europe. Okay, so if we wanted to be technically correct, we could call this the feudal fundamental class process, okay, or the feudal FCP, just to kind of designate it, right? This is a form of production and appropriation that has a unique set of, political and cultural forces and natural forces which support it, okay? So I know we've talked about this in previous lectures, right? But here we have the lord, and here we have the serf, right? So and this is like the economic basis of feudalism, feudal fundamental class process, right? So the lord, if we talk about who's producing and who's appropriating, right? Obviously, the serf is the producer, right? And they are going to perform necessary labor and surplus labor, right? So, and they do this in a particular setup, right, historically, okay? So, because of the history here, we associate this with, agriculture. It need not be agricultural, but it's associated with that, okay? So, as I said, right, the serf performs necessary labor on a piece of land that they have a traditional right to, okay? That's called the tenure. And then they perform surplus labor on a different piece of land owned by the lord. I mean, all of the land is owned by the lords, but the lord's land, okay, that's called a domain. And so it's very, very clear what the distinction between necessary and surplus labor is, right? So the lord is the appropriator. They appropriate the surplus labor. And this is different from other fundamental class processes. The lord does not appropriate the entire product, right? They don't oversee this part of the production process is not something they deal with, right? The serfs, you go and do that on your own, right? What I care about is there's a certain number of the days of the week or year or however it's broken down that you are obligated to produce on the domain, okay? This is like I said, the corvée labor system. You are obligated to perform labor on the domain these and these days, okay? This is a corvée day. You must come and do that labor, okay? And so the feudal fundamental class process, if we want to talk about all of its conditions of existence, okay, it is supported by, okay, this is going to be a long list. I can only do a few of these, obviously, because it's a long and complex history, but it's supported by certain kind of political processes. Okay, so why does this this is obviously and evidently exploitation, right? I mean, it's crystal clear. Nobody's trying to hide it. You can't hide it. You have a group of people who spend a good deal of their time working for the benefit of somebody else, right? How on earth is this supported? Well, who wields all the power in this society, right? Who makes the decisions? The decisions are made by lords, right? I mean, the lords, they have the political power, okay? And a lot of this rests on their military power, all right? So, famous quote from Mao Zedong, power flows out of the barrel of a gun, right? Well, this is kind of pre-gun here, right? But you could just as easily say flows out of the hilt of a sword. That would make it relevant to the feudal era, right? So lords have political power, they have military power, they are the ones who make laws and are also in charge of the enforcement, right? Um, so the this kind of exploitation is legal, right? It is designated by the law, right? So we could we have, for example, another political process, another law, right? Only lords can own land, right? So lords own and control a key part of a key asset there, right? Like a key resource. The only way you can get access to that is by doing this, right? By participating in the corvée labor system. I mean, you could try to be a lord yourself, but the lords, again, they have a lot of political and military power. They defend their ownership of the land, right? So, okay, this supports the system of feudalism. Now, when we talk about distribution of surplus, um, how do you make sure that you continue to have this, right? How do you make sure that you continue to have the political and military power that you need, right? Well, you're going to have to pay for that. I mean, militaries are expensive, right? I mean, you know, you need to create the infrastructure which allows you to effectively wield political power. Okay, and this is a lot of what lords do. Our modern political system is built on the history of lords developing their political and military power. Okay, like you study European history, and you're going to study a whole succession of different wars, right? What is that? Well, that is the competition and development of military power, which ideally produces an empire, right? So here's the thing, though, right? In order to make sure you have this power, you must pay tribute. Okay, so this is a distribution of surplus, right? That is, the lords have to take a portion of their surplus, and they have to give it to the lord above them, right? So, the lords have many different levels, right? There are lords who are subservient to other lords, right? So on top we have the king, and then we have the more important lords, the baron or the duke, like this, right? Etc. So you have levels of lords, um, okay, like this, and many other terms for this that I'm not mentioning, that are differ by country and language and stuff like this, right? So the way this system works is the lord above you, then you have to pay tribute to that lord, right? That lord has to then pay tribute to the baron and to the king, etc. Okay, so they have to take a portion of their surplus, which is initially in the form of crops, and they have to give that to the lord to whom they owe their allegiance. Okay, so the the entire system is also supported by not just political but also a certain culture, right? It has cultural processes. Okay, so I'm using this term like you owe your allegiance, right? You are bound by oaths of honor, right? Oaths of fealty. Okay, so you swear an oath, and an oath is understood to be like a very, very serious thing, right? So the serfs promise to obey, to perform the labor, to honor the corvée. They'll try and dress it up, and they won't say, "Oh, will you promise that I can exploit you?" They probably won't say it that way, right? They'll say it in a nice, flowery way, right? But it's the same thing, right? It's understood by all. The meaning has been created, right, through cultural processes, through an education process, through an understanding that everyone in the society knows their place, right? So as the British put it, that phrase, you know your place, means, okay, again, culture is a whole variety of different things, right? It's the meaning that we give to the world. How is that created? I mean, It's created through books, through arguments. It's created through songs. It's created through a whole variety of different ways, right? And so what we're talking about is processes which support the existing division of labor, right? The serfs being the ones who perform the necessary and surplus labor, deliver that surplus labor to their lord in the form of the corvée. I mentioned over time the corvée system changes and develops. Okay, over we have then the payment in the form of crops, and then ultimately we have payment in cash. I put the dollar symbol. Obviously, they're not using the dollar in Europe, but you over time the system changes, morphs, develops. Okay, but still you have these politics. You have the culture that supports that. Okay, we could mention the role of religion. Okay, so religion really supports the system of serfdom, right? The feudal fundamental class process. Okay, so the Christian church is the dominant, by far the dominant religion in Europe. It's not the only religion in Europe. Of course, there are Jews, there are some Muslims, there are other religions as well. There are those that do not fit into this, right? What the Christians call pagans. So Druids and so forth, right? There's indigenous European religion, I suppose we could call it. But the point is that the Christian church over time becomes the dominant religion in Europe. And the Christian church, crafts its theology to really support European feudalism, right? So the Christian church, for example, comes up with the great chain of being. Right? Great chain of being comes from a theologian named Aquinas. And this is the idea that there is a divinely ordained hierarchy in society, right? So it's like the one that exists, right? So the kings, dukes, and barons and lords, and then we have the knight, and we have the serf, and then way down here we have the dog, not far from the serf, right? So it's like, is everyone seen as equal in the society? No, not at all, right? That's not the ideology. That's not the religion, And what is on top of this system, right? Right above the king is God, right? Jesus is in there somewhere, right? So that's the great chain of being, in brief, a hierarchy that supports the feudal exploitation that is prominent in Europe, okay? And, the Christian church is not just supporting this ideologically, right? They're not just supporting this culturally. The feudal church actually becomes the largest single feudal landowner in all of Europe. The largest landowner in Europe. So by the time we get to 1800 or so, right, the church owns more land than any other single entity in Europe. Okay, and this has to do with tithing. Over time, the church says, listen, you're going to have a better shot at getting into heaven if you support the church. And, if you're going to pass away, why don't you give your lands to the church, right? And what does the church do then? Well, instead of there being a feudal lord who, with the domain and whatever, it's a church authority, So the church fits in very well. They take the place of the feudal lord, They say, well, there used to be a lord living in this castle, but now there's a bishop. But they don't do anything differently, right? Like, the corvée is still in place, Are you still expected, the serfs still expected to go and work on the domain, however many days a week they are designated? It might be 3 days of the week for the domain, and then you'd have 3 days a week on your own tenure. And then what would you do on that seventh day? Well, the seventh day is the Sabbath, right? That's on that day you would go to church and etc. Right? So again, Christianity is a very, very powerful force in Europe at the time. It got weaker over time, right? But if we look at, say, 1500 or so in Europe, um, or 1800, I mean, that's the peak of the church's power, arguably. Um, they are incredibly dominant as an institution, right? A wealthy, powerful. They have an influence over law and politics. They have a huge influence over the culture, right? And they are very much wedded to the feudal system. They support the feudal system. Okay, so Marx's general point in here, right? So what Marx likes to refer to, he calls his method dialectical materialism. So I've referred to that in previous lectures. What does this mean, and so forth. But Marx is basically saying, look, your material conditions, the way that you make a living, the way that you get money, the way that you get resources, the way that you get your needs met in the world, is going to shape your ideology. It's going to shape your politics. It's going to shape your views on economics and everything else, right? Your material conditions determine a lot. And let's not pretend that we're all such highly principled, idealistic people that our material conditions have nothing to do with it. Well, they do have something to do with it, right? So this is what Marx meant in part by this dialectical materialism, right? We've got to look at the material conditions of a person, of a class, of a society, right? Is that all that's going to determine it? No, not at all, right? The dialectical part means, look, societies are complex, they're contradictory. We have lots and lots of interrelated forces that determine anything we could think of in the society. We expect to find contradiction. We don't expect to find things moving in only one direction, right? Okay, so when we talk about the distribution of surplus, right, we are talking about things that support European feudalism, right? Do these things have to be paid for? Of course they do, right? So I mentioned they have to pay tribute, right? Do you have to, if you want these cultural processes to take place, where the serfs, swear an oath and a promise to obey and whatever, do you have to somehow inculcate the idea that that is the right way to run a society? You do, right? How might you do that? Well, you might uphold the honor and the nobility of the system in many, many different ways, all right? How can you make the system seem less like brutal exploitation and more like something beautiful and noble, Like that when you think of kings and barons and lords, you think of something good, You don't think of something bad. Well, you might have to hire painters who paint your portrait and make you look really good, Make you look, you're riding off on your white horse and, oh, you just look amazing, right? The light is hitting you at a certain way, right? Do you see what I'm saying, right? That everything has a role to play in supporting or attenuating, or perhaps is neutral to, the system of class exploitation, okay? So the lords have to take a portion of their surplus. That is, they have to take a portion of the crops that they are getting from their serfs and use them for all these purposes, right? They have to use them to hire and train and keep an army, right? They have to have knights that support their power, right? They have to have songs and paintings and artwork that uplift the nobility, because the whole thing rests on nobility, right? Like, what makes you a serf? What makes you a lord versus a serf, right? Well, it's this concept, right? The lords are noble, so you have to uphold that. What does it mean to be noble? It means you have this fancy lacy sleeve, right? Your fancy lacy collar, It means that you have fancy manners. It means that when you drink tea, your pinky comes out, stuff like that. I know I'm making it sound ridiculous, right? But a lot of our manners and customs and ideas about things actually come from the feudal period, right? Because it's a lengthy period in European history, and of course it's still with us, right? The past is still with us. It still shapes our thinking, right? That we think of lords as noble, that we romanticize them, Um, that's an effect of the power of the feudal ideology. Okay, the cultural processes. The point from Marxism is that has to be paid for, right? And it gets paid for out of the surplus. Okay, so lords commonly had singers, artists, poetry, all kinds of things like this, right? Cultural workers, we could call them, right? And their purpose, if you produce songs and poems that are down with the king, down with the lord, well, you're not going to get patronage that way, right? You're not going to. A lord is not going to pay for you to live. They are not going to support you if you're not supporting feudalism, right? So, right, you see, all of these things have to be paid for out of the surplus. Okay. Now, if the demands on the surplus become greater and greater, that can cause a problem, right? So this is the contradictions of the system, right? All right, so class contradictions can occur, right? This is what we saw in terms of the ending of feudalism and its transition to another kind of production, okay? So class contradictions, right? That is, we have class struggle, we have a struggle over the surplus. Feudalism always had this, right? Always had people saying the lords are not particularly noble, you know. Um, I mean, yes, they have fancy manners and they have big, nice horses and whatever, but right, does that mean they're better, kinder, wiser, smarter than anybody else? No, I mean, not absolutely not, right? A whole succession of cruel, incompetent lords and kings proved that to everybody over time, right? Um, and people start to say, well, the lords are not better; they're not more noble. Uh, they're. I think it's possible that all men are created equal, right? All men are created equal, right? See how this is a contradiction? All men created equal. Read the words from the Declaration of Independence. That is essentially an anti-feudal type of statement, right? That's saying, look, I'm not in favor of this hierarchy. I don't care what the great chain of being says. It's not right. All men are created equal, and we should have a system where everyone votes, right? So these are contradictions. Even if they don't emerge out of the class process, they're still contradictions, right? Okay, so let's return to our topic of the fundamental class processes. Okay, so here's what I've mentioned. Okay, so the five fundamental class processes. We got number one, the feudal FCP, feudal fundamental class process, and this has again a set of cultural and political and social and natural processes which support it, right? But we have something very important. Okay, the serfs are not owned by the lords, right? They are free citizens. Okay. Now, what that means exactly when you're obligated to perform labor for half your working life to somebody else, is open to some dispute. But this is to counterpose this kind of production to other forms of production that don't have that, right? Where they do have people that are owned, right? So, the serfs are, they're bound to the lords by ties of loyalty and obligation, right? They have a ceremony where they swear these oaths and stuff. That ceremony is actually very similar to the marriage ceremony. Isn't that interesting, right? Our notion of marriage actually comes out of this, right? Everything is bound together, right? So our notion of marriage between, romantic marriage, right? That comes out of the feudal period and is very, very similar to the kinds of oaths that the serfs swear to the lord and the lord swear to the serfs, right? So the feudal fundamental class process is like this, right? It has a unique set of cultural and political processes which produce this kind of thing, right? Something that is like the European example. Now, does it have to occur in Europe? Does it have to occur in 1500? No, not at all, right? So we could have forms of this, right? We're trying to define something that is, like a type, So okay, we're referring a lot to European history because obviously that shapes our understanding of what is this type of fundamental class process all about, right? Okay, so let's contrast it to another type of production here, okay? Okay, so that is the slave fundamental class process, okay? Often simply called slavery, right? This is another form of production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus. It's a very common one, right? It has thousands and thousands of years of history. It goes back to ancient Rome. Since the feudal era in Europe occurs after the fall of Rome, there was a lot where feudalism was counterposed to the slavery of the Roman Empire that existed before that, right? So, the formation of feudalism, I said, well, you're free citizens now. You're not owned by anybody. You're free to enter into an oath, to swear an oath, right? That's very different than the slavery which occurred before, right? The relationships between the producer and the appropriator are very different, right? But in both cases, it's somebody else, right? Like the we have the slave here. The slave performs necessary labor and surplus labor, and then we have the slave master is the one who appropriates. Now, the appropriation is different here as well, right? So the slaves are not doing work over here on their tenure and over there on the domain. They're producing a product which the master is going to take the entire thing, okay? So this is different, right? The slave has a little bit less autonomy, right? The master is going to take everything they produce. They're not going to leave them on their own to produce their own necessary labor. They're going to take the entire product, okay? And then they are going to give the slave what is, we could call it the master's provision, okay? The reality is that if you want your slaves to not perish, you have to give them something, right? You have to give them food, clothing, shelter, etc., right? You have to fulfill their needs. Otherwise, they die. I mean, by definition, right? Now, you might die slowly over time if you receive, let's say, 80% of the calories that you need. It's going to take you a while, right? You're still going to perish. But it's going to take a while, right? Or maybe you don't get enough rest to sustain yourself, and then you fall ill and die because of overwork, right? That's totally possible, right? You're not giving enough, time to your slaves, and that is going to cause them to die as a result of their enslavement. It's going to produce a very brutal form of slavery, right? So, in general, the master's provision, okay, so if we call the master's provision P, okay, so in general, that's going to be equal to the necessary labor, right? That causes a sustainable version of slavery, right? Now, you might want the slaves to work harder. You might want them to have better treatment for some reason, right? There may be reasons why the provision is actually greater than the necessary labor. And we have examples of this. We have privileged slaves. The Roman slavery produces lots of examples of this, right? Slaves which are relatively privileged, they are receiving more than their bare minimum that they need, right? And of course, the provision could also be less than the necessary labor. It's not necessary to say it's equal, greater than, or less than. We have different examples of this, right? So if it's less than, like I mentioned, it's going to be brutal on the slaves, right? It's going to kill the slaves, whether it kills them quickly or slowly. The death toll is going to be very high. But we have lots of examples of this kind of brutal slavery as well, right? So the point is, we have a different set of conditions of existence which supports slavery, the slave fundamental class process, then supports the feudal fundamental class process. Okay, they have some similarities. They also have some differences. Okay, so one of the big differences is obviously that the slave is owned. Okay, so now we could look at in what sense do we mean that by, right? Is the person of the slave owned? Okay, so um, either the person or now in the modern era, what we've seen is variations of slavery in which the person themselves is not owned, but the labor power, okay, that's the capacity of the person to perform labor. If that is owned by another person, and there are times and places which conspire to make that a possibility, right? Um, so if either the person or the labor power of the person is owned by another, and we have a set of cultural processes, okay, so slave is owned, and we have a set of cultural processes which create an objectification, okay, of the slave. This has been described as a cultural death by one great theorist of slavery, Patterson, um, or as a not being a non-person, right? Objectification means that a person becomes a thing. Okay, so we see an example of this under Roman law, right? Roman law is the basis of our modern legal system in a lot of ways, right? Because they had slaves, they had a special category for a person who was deemed a thing, right? A person who could be property of somebody else, right? A kind of person thing, a person that could make the decisions, but was legally speaking a thing. They called this a res, was their Roman concept for this, right? So slavery is supported by some kind of process of objectification where the person dies as an individual and is reborn as a thing, as an object, as a tool which can be used by others without consequence, right? So now lots and lots of different forces support slavery and the slave fundamental class process. Okay, so for example, in the modern era, we have racism that supports the slave fundamental class process. Okay, or to be more specific, it's white supremacy, right? So that is the notion that the African slaves are inferior and that the white Europeans are superior. Okay? Now, this is a relatively new idea in society. It seems to come out of the contradiction between, well, we have this idea, all men are created equal, right? Since that's in the Declaration of Independence, 1776, and since that American Revolution is actually successful, real long shot at the time, right? It could have been suppressed by the British. The British was the most powerful empire, arguably, in the world at the time. So, but since it's successful, we get a conflict between, well, all right, we have, on the one hand, all men are created equal, but on the other hand, we have a class of permanent slaves. Their children are going to be born into slavery. How do we square that, right? I mean, you're not equal if you're born a slave, not at all, right? Racism is what allows the ideology to square it, right? To say, well, these Africans are inferior, okay? So, and that has to be created, that has to be supported, it has a material basis, right? That's the point of Marxism. Okay, you have to take a portion of the surplus and use it to secure that culture, right? People have to, make that argument. That argument has to be spread in society, right? We have to have a culture where that's understood, right? And it's created through all kinds of different ways, right? It's created through different works of art that depict those Africans or those of African descent in ways that are very bad, right? Very negative, very unflattering, right? That depicts them as being very happy to be enslaved, right? That they need the support and guidance of their European superiors, right? So this obviously, I mean, this is all racist nonsense. But the point is that there's a reason why it existed, right? There's a reason it existed because there's an economic basis, right? The slave fundamental class process, very prevalent, not just in the United States during the antebellum period, but in many, many different societies. It must be supported with conditions of existence that make it possible for it to continue. Okay, so now, does this involve exploitation? Yes, absolutely. Of course it does, right? So let's just put an E next to these ones that involve exploitation, right? So feudalism, feudal fundamental class process, slave fundamental class process, both of them involve exploitation. All right, number three, the one that Marx is quite interested in, right? The capitalism. Okay, so to put this all in the same terms, we might call this the capitalist fundamental class process. Okay, just to be technically correct. Okay, capitalist fundamental class process. So here we have a different thing, right? So we unlike the feudal fundamental class process, we don't have oaths that somebody is swearing. You don't have to, serve and obey your feudal lord. No, you don't have to do that anymore, right? You don't have that obligation. You don't have to get married to your employer or whatever, right? You don't have to have some kind of ceremony. And the employer does not own the employee, okay? So that makes it very different from these other historical forms, right? Different from feudalism and slavery. Okay, so we have something new going on, right? We have the capitalist, and we have the worker, and like I have described in the Labor Theory of Value lecture and in a lecture on feudalism and transition from feudalism to capitalism, right? We have a different breakdown here, right? The worker is, they're performing the necessary and the surplus labor, but they're producing a product, right? So they're performing necessary and surplus labor. What they're doing here is they are adding value. Okay, so the necessary and surplus labor, we've described this as the V plus the S. Okay, so in terms of Marxism, right, we would call this the living labor. Okay, now they are adding that value to the capital, right, the tools, equipment, raw materials. Okay, what I described before as constant capital, or C. Okay, so all this stuff is being added together, right? Living labor together with embodied labor, okay? And that is producing a sum of value, okay? A sum of value. Now, the capitalist is going to own the value that the workers produce. Okay, they are going to own the entire thing. So that's actually pretty similar to slavery, right? The capitalist does appropriate the entire product, right? But listen, they're not giving a master's provision to some, slaves that they own. They're not doing that at all, right? Though they take the total value, they pay the workers a wage, right? They pay the workers a wage. So Marx says, look, this is a lot harder to understand because the value of the wage, okay, Marx argues, the wage is equal to the value of labor power, okay? That is, it comes out of a market, okay? The worker is not paid more or less than the value of, their potential to perform labor during that time, right? So if the wage is, for example, let's say the wage is $15 an hour, and that is the prevailing wage, right? So when we say it's prevailing, okay, or the prevailing wage, what it means is, look, that's just simply the going rate for workers in that industry or that level of skill or whatever. There's competition, okay, there's competition between employers and between employees, which cause, in general, right, usually what competition does, competition causes the price and the value to be equal in general, right? There's lots of exceptions to this rule, but that's, long established idea from political economy that Marx also uses. Okay, so competition tends to equalize price and value. So the wages that workers receive are the prevailing wage, right? They are what's, so to say, fair. But the result is, by working for a wage, you end up producing a lot more value, right? The living labor that you perform, that you produce there, is much greater than what you receive, right? And so the workers exploited, right? Even though the wage is fair, they're not exploited because, they're getting paid too low of a wage, right? Like, oh, this would be even worse if they were getting $10 an hour. But see, Marx is saying is that even at 15, we haven't gotten rid of the problem, right? The problem is someone else is taking the surplus, right? The capitalist, what is covered up, what we cannot see as easily as with the feudal or slave fundamental class process, is that the capitalist appropriates the surplus. And this is what makes them rich over time, right? Not every capitalist, some capitalists fail, right? They don't succeed in the market. But the point is, right, they have a chance to become fantastically wealthy here that the workers will not have, right? You cannot do that if your surplus is going to somebody else, okay? So capitalism also involves exploitation, okay? It's a different kind of exploitation. It's a new historical form, but it is exploitative in much the same way as slavery, as feudalism. So Marx is like, look, we had a revolution to overturn feudalism, and then we want to replace it with a different style of lord who's going to exploit us? No, right? That's as silly as saying, okay, no more beatings. Stop that. You're beating me with a bat. This is no problem. I'll switch to this belt. No, not acceptable, right? Not. That's just a different implement. I don't want a beating at all, right? I don't want exploitation. Don't give me a new form of it. We want to get rid of it altogether. Okay. So what are our options? Could we have class processes that don't involve exploitation? Well, yes, right? So number 4, we could have the worker themselves own and control, produce, own, and control the surplus, right? Um, and this actually has existed for a long time, so long that Marx actually calls it the ancient fundamental class process, right? Um, Although at other times, sometimes he calls it things that are a little bit less flattering, like, for example, the petty bourgeois um, uh, process, or sometimes it's just called independent commodity production or other things. Okay, so a number of different things. Because Marx was not really very focused on this. It's not his interest, right? He does take note, right? Careful student of history does take note that yes, this occurs throughout history, but it's not the thing that Marx wants to go forward, right, into the future, into a system that actually doesn't exist yet, right? What might that look like? Right? Socialism, communism. He doesn't want to go backwards into antiquity. He doesn't want to go back into the past. So the ancient fundamental class process then is the worker individually produces and appropriates their own surplus. All right, so we would say, look, no exploitation is present here, right? This is good, right, from the perspective of Marxism. Um, but Marxists have typically viewed this as not great, right? Because they said, look, this is too individualistic. A lot of kinds of production don't really lend themselves to one worker individually producing. Um, the focus of a lot of Marxism is on collectivity, right? Is on society, on groups, not individuals producing, right? This goes back, like I said, it has a long history. It goes back to like the medieval guild production, even before that, right? Into ancient Rome had lots of the ancient fundamental class process. Not everyone in ancient Rome was a slave, right, or a slave master. You had plenty of producers who were independent commodity producers, right? That is, they are producing goods and services for the market, um, and they are working by themselves, appropriating their own surplus. Um, they have no employee, they have no boss, right? There's plenty of people who work in this manner today, right? We don't call them petty bourgeois or independent commodity producers. We don't really know what to call them in the United States, right? We call them, you're an owner employee, maybe you might call it that, or you're a small business owner, right? You have one employee, or yourself, right? That's so we don't have like a great name for this, right? But it's the concept has existed for a long time because it's an old kind of production. Okay, so it doesn't involve exploitation, but Marxists are not fond of it. The other problem with it is, look, if you're producing commodities for the market, there's going to be a lot of the same problems that come along with capitalism. I mean, how are you going to grow as an individual producer? Is it not easy for this kind of production to become I mean, like the successful commodity producers are going to probably hire workers, right? I mean, and then the unsuccessful ones are going to become workers, and pretty soon we have capitalism again with all of its problems, right? So even though the ancient fundamental class process does not involve exploitation, Marxists have been, not super fond of it, because they're fond of this fifth one, right? That is the communal fundamental class process. All right, the communal fundamental class process, like the name implies, right? That is a group of workers who collectively, together, produce and appropriate their own surplus. Okay, they produce and appropriate their own surplus. So again, we have examples of this going far back into history, right? We have cases where people were doing independent commodity production, but they were working together with a few others and sharing the proceeds of that. That did exist historically. Typically, it's been marginal. It hasn't been a big part of the economy. We have it up to this present day, right? These are often called uh, worker-owned enterprises, or sometimes they're called worker co-ops. Um, worker co-ops. So, this again, no exploitation here, right? Uh, because exploitation occurs at the point of production. Okay, so there's many different sites of production. There's many different points where production takes place, and exploitation occurs there, right? Like that's where somebody produces and then someone appropriates. Is it the same person or group of people, right? Is it somebody else? Those are key questions in Marxism. Okay, so the what we've talked about here, the class processes, okay, the 5 fundamental class processes, this is occurring at a micro level in society, okay? So there's lots and lots of these. Typically we have, many of these occurring at the same time, okay? So we have many class processes. And the class processes are often conflict with one another or contradict each other in various ways. Maybe they support each other in some ways as well, right? So many class processes, they compete, conflict with one another. Sometimes they support each other, sometimes they undermine each other, and sometimes both, right? That's the complexity of this, okay? So let me just give you a couple of examples, okay? So in the United States, right, pre 1865, right, before abolition of slavery and so forth, you had a number of these class processes competing and struggling with one another. Okay, so you had, for example, the slave and the capitalist fundamental class processes, okay, in competition with each other, right? So slave fundamental class processes mostly concentrated in the South, right? Mostly in agriculture and, mostly growing cotton. That's the big cash crop, okay? So, but however, that's not all that's going on even in the South, right? The South has a small but developing capitalism as well. They also have the ancient fundamental class process in addition, right? That is, they have small independent producers, producing goods and services for the market. It's not just goods, right? We think about the small town lawyer. What are they doing, right? They're doing the ancient fundamental class process, okay? They don't have a boss, they don't have an employer, that's not working for a wage. They are producing a service for sale on the market and then appropriating their own surplus, okay? So this exists, right, throughout there's also some slavery in the North, and in the West. So it's not just, the fact is these two fundamental class processes are in contradiction with one another, right? They are for a while they support one another, and then they start to kind of undermine each other, right? And that is when secession occurs and so forth, right? So the point is you have all these, and along the way you have some scattered instances of the communal class process, but this is very small, right? These two are large, right? So we got a lot of this going on, right? We've got less of this, and we have a little tiny bit of that, right? That's our kind of rough, gauge of how much of this is happening, right? But the point is, now we don't have much in the way of the feudal fundamental class process going on. It's not very present in United States history, okay? Now some have pointed out that even though this isn't very prevalent in terms of market production, there's one place where it has remained, right? And one place where it has remained is in households. Right? Households are very much have that feudal structure, okay? So now it's not agricultural based, right? It doesn't have that appearance that it had that's exactly like, medieval Europe. But it has the same structure, right? That is oaths of honor and loyalty and love and obedience, right? Because aren't all those things part of the traditional marriage contract, right? Between a man and a woman or whatever, right? That's traditional marriage. That's the basis of almost every household in U.S. history. I mean, now there are some that have a different basis, but again, Marxists have pointed out for a long time that this kind of production, though it's not common in agriculture, it's not common in industry, it's pretty well universal in households. Okay, so we would have to let's add that, right? Let's say this actually is fairly prevalent in the United States for a lot of its history, okay, up to the present. Ancient class process less so, okay, communal class process less so, okay, because this is less supported, right? Do we have the legal and cultural structures in place that support a group of people collectively producing? We don't, right? This is a very individualistic society, okay? So on the micro level, we have often contradiction or conflict between different fundamental class processes, and that allows us to show, look, there's change as a result of that, right? So we call that class transformation, okay? Because of course what happens over time in the United States is the capitalist fundamental class process grows, the slave fundamental class process diminishes, though it is never completely goes away, as I'll talk about in another lecture. The ancient and communal class processes are still present as minority class processes. The feudal class process has waned somewhat, right? Households are a little bit less likely to have that structure. So change, transformation is very much part of this whole thing, all right? Now, if we look at this on the macro level, okay, now many Marxists do, right? Many Marxists look at just the whole society and are like, well, what do we call the whole society? I don't want to get into all this detail about, what's going on with the class processes and what is being supported and being under what, whatever. I just want to kind of give a name to the whole society and say, okay, well, what class process seems to dominate the society? Okay, what class process seems to dominate? And Marxists have usually called this the mode of production. Okay, the mode of production. It's a little bit more simplified, right? Because again, it abstracts a little bit from the fact that every society, even those ones that have a very dominant mode of production, there's always a lot of other stuff going on, right? And in order to like really fully understand that, we actually have to kind of get into the details and look at, well, what are the contradictions that are occurring? What is the class struggle and so forth, right? But I'm just mentioning this for completeness, right? Mode of production. And when people are talking about the mode of production, they often use these terms, right? Like capitalism, feudalism, slavery, etc., right? So, this is like the big picture. This is like a view from 30,000 feet, You can see certain things from way up high, but there's certain things that you're not going to be able to see well because, you need to get a little closer, okay? So very, very common, right? But here's the thing, okay? When we're talking about society, we want to always be aware that there's a risk, right? There is a risk of essentialism, okay? There's a risk of making a deterministic essentialism or determinism, a deterministic kind of argument, right? Like we need to simplify, but if things become too simplistic, that's going to be a problem, right? We're going to overlook things. We're going to overlook that there's a lot of mystery and ambiguity. There's a lot of complexity, a lot of contradiction in society. It is possible for us to be wrong, right? It's possible for us to overlook that all of this stuff is a process, right? That even our act of thinking about it, of looking at it, of trying to understand it, is itself an intervention which changes society, right? Because everything is connected to everything else, right? So we want to try to avoid that, right? That is, we want to try to avoid saying that, any of these modes of production or whatever have an essence, that would be an essentialism. And that leads us down a kind of not a good path, right? Because, essentialism gives a very shallow understanding of things, right? It makes it simple, makes it clear, that's good, right? But it's shallow and it's easy to be wrong, okay? So that's my lecture on class analysis. Thank you very much.